Yo, what's up, nerds? It's MTG Man, and I'm here to talk about 100 cards I think that are interesting and that fit really well into cubes. I've been helping some friends build cubes. I think I'm like really getting the hang of it. But here's some interesting cards that I think would be good to add to your own cubes, good to build cubes around, whatever. Um, First off is Marauding Maulhorn and Advocate of the Beast. Marauding Maulhorn is a 4 mana 5/3 that has to attack each combat if able, unless you control Advocate of the Beast. And Advocate of the Beast, at the beginning of your end step, you put a +1/+1 counter on target beast creature you control. There's this thing in sets where cards are going to refer to each other. And I think that it's important to make your cube feel like a cohesive set, is having cards that are going to be talking about each other. Plus, Advocate of the Beast is an elf, so it's got a pretty relevant creature type to begin with. And Marauding Maulhorn, sure, it's a beast, so it'll get +1/+1 counters, but it's just a normally okay statted creature. So it's not really going to drag the deck down when, not being used. Um, Next up, 3 mana blue draw spells. Now, this is oddly specific, but a lot of sets seem to have these, and I'm a big fan of them. They're things like Baleful Stare, where target opponent reveals their hand and you draw a card for each mountain and red card in it. Borrowing 100,000 Arrows, where you draw a card for each tap creature target opponent controls. Keep Watch draws a card for each attacking creature. Lunar Insight, draw a card for each different mana value among non-land permanents you control. And there's even typal things like Mass Appeal, where you draw a card for each human you control. I think these cards are just important. We have a lot of draw in different sets, and while sure, you're going to have that 1 mana draw spell, that Opt, that Serum Vision, whatever, I think having a 3 mana draw spell is also somewhat important, especially if it's like somewhat easily, put in like an uncommon slot. Next up, Agency Outfitter along with Magnifying Glass and Thinking Cap. Again, I really like these cards that are going to refer to each other. So when Agency Outfitter enters, you search your graveyard, hand, or library for a card named Magnifying Glass and or Thinking Cap and put it onto the battlefield. So I mean, sure, it comes in as a 6 mana 4/3 with flying, which is kind of understated, but then it also gets you a mana rock and an equipment that's going to bump up its stats, so that's a 5/5. It's not perfect, it's not incredibly strong, and if you're putting it in a cube, somebody's going to have to draft all 3 cards for it to really be good. However, that could be somebody's win con, or it just gives something to look forward to, or cards to find while drafting. A similar one, Renowned Weaponsmith, where you can tap it, pay a blue, search your library for a card named Heartpiercer Bow or Vial of Dragonfire and put it into your hand. Vial of Dragonfire is kind of just bad removal, and Heartpiercer Bow is just kind of a meh equipment. However, it just gives you more options. Plus, being able to tap it for 2 colorless to, cast artifact spells is pretty solid, and a 1/3 isn't terrible stats. Bog Brew Witch, somewhat similar, but it'll let you find a Bubbling Cauldron, or a Festering Newt. Festering Newt is good removal if you have a Bog Brew Witch, and Bubbling Cauldron can let you sacrifice Festering Newt to make an opponent lose 4 life. Nothing crazy, alright? Nothing wild, it's just they reference back to each other, and it's going to make your set feel more cohesive. These 2 cards are just kind of similar. Sangrophage and Carnophage, they're overstated black creatures with wicked art. I have to say, I'm a big fan of the art on these 2. But during your upkeep, you pay 1 life or you tap it. Or during your upkeep, tap it unless you pay 2 life. So there's a downside. However, they have solid stats, especially for their mana cost. And I think there's just interesting play space. 2 similar cards, Armed with Proof and Arterial Alchemy. Arterial Alchemy is going to work better in a multiplayer type of cube, but Armed with Proof is probably better for just a standard cube. So when Armed with Proof enters, you investigate twice, and then your clues are also equipments, and can be equipped for 2 and give a creature +2/+0. Same with Arterial Alchemy. It creates Bloods, and then the Bloods are also equipment, give +2/+0 and equip 2. Why do I like these? So first off, it can help you draw, because you can use the clue or the blood token to help you draw cards. It also is going to help with equipment strategies because they become equipments. It's going to help with artifact strategies because they are artifacts. It also helps with token strategies because they're tokens. There's a large number of decks that this can fit into. It's not just going to help one sort of deck. Even if you're just playing a creature deck, being able to create, 2 equipments, even if it isn't all that much, is just going to be something. So I just think they're definitely interesting and can find spots into certain people's cubes, especially if you have underlying themes like equipment, or, if blood tokens are a thing in your cube, this might just be better than it looks. Next up, I think every cube should have some sort of cycle, and one of my favorite cycles is the Martyrs. So Martyr of Ashes, Martyr of Bones, Martyr of Frost, Martyr of Sands, and Martyr of Spores. They're all a 1 mana creature. I think they're all 1/1s, and you can either pay 2 or 1 depending on which one they are. And you reveal a number of cards that share the color with them, and they do a certain thing. So Martyr of Spores, you sacrifice it, reveal X green cards from your hand, and target creature gets +X/+X until end of turn. Martyr of Sands, you sacrifice it, reveal X white cards, and gain 3 times X life. If you have 7 white cards in your hand, you're gaining 21 life, which is a little nuts and probably not going to happen in draft, but it's just a cool little option. They're small, they're low-to-the-ground creatures. I mean, you can play them turn 1, and even if they don't do anything till later in the game, Martyr of Ashes could just wipe the board. Martyr of Bones can help get rid of recursive strategies. Martyr of Frost is a counterspell. They're all going to do something later in the game for you, and they'll just help you fill out your board consistently. Next up, I think a lot of cubes and just any sort of draft environment in general, it's nice to have some sort of built-in combo. Even if it's just something small like Urban Burgeoning, you enchant a land, and you untap this land during each other player's untap step. And then you have Squirrel Nest, where you can tap the land to create a 1/1. So you're just creating, a 1/1 every turn. It's a small combo, it's not winning the game immediately, but I think having combos built in that players can look for while drafting are just going to make the draft way more interesting. Moving on to just more general cards, Archetype of Courage is a 3 mana 2/2, that's going to give your creatures first strike, and then your opponent's creatures lose first strike and can't gain first strike. I just think it's going to help whatever deck needs it. If it's a go wide deck, first strike is going to help your 1/1s hit first, and they're going to be harder to block. Or if it's a go tall deck, a 5/5 with first strike is going to be a lot harder to block than a 5/5 without first strike. Beast of Burden is a 6 mana creature, and its power and toughness are equal to the number of creatures in play, so it's really going to scale with the game. If your opponent has a bunch of creatures out, it's going to be really big. If you have a bunch of creatures out, it's going to be really big. It's going to punish your opponent's token strategies. And sure, if your opponent's creatures die, or your creatures die, or the board's wiped, it's not going to be as good. But I like this kind of card that scales with the game. Blood Rage Brawler. It's a 2 mana 4/3, and when it enters, you discard a card. While that does seem like a pretty big downside, I think you can build a cube with cards in mind that want to go to the graveyard or want to be discarded, and a 2 mana 4/3 is just really solidly statted, and it could just be a pretty solid threat. I mean, turn 1 you play your 1/1, turn 2 you play your 4/3, and then you put your opponent on a 4-turn clock. Booby Trap, I just think this card's really interesting, especially in a cube environment where you know what cards are in the set, or even if you don't know what cards are in the set, you've seen the cards go around the table while being drafted, so you have this idea of what people have. So when it comes into play, you name a card other than a basic land and choose an opponent. That opponent reveals each card he or she draws, and when they draw the named card, you sacrifice it, and Booby Trap deals 10 damage to them. Sure, 10 damage isn't going to kill a player, but I just think it's a interesting play pattern, and especially if you're doing something with outside mechanics, like if you have a cube that isn't just a cube, like you're playing, what's that one with like you reveal artifacts and whatever, and you get free artifacts? I think the Prof did a video on it, but if you have some sort of outside mechanic where you can get free cards, or maybe there's like an item shop mechanic, I think Booby Trap is interesting because it's going to punish the opponent for playing a certain powerful card. Breakthrough, you draw 4 cards, then choose X cards in your hand and discard the rest. I think this has a lot of interesting playstyles, because if you have, creatures that are whenever you draw a card, blank happens, this is going to help that. If you have creatures that want to be in the graveyard, this is going to be a good way to draw cards, get cards into your hand, and then discard what you want to get rid of. I think Breakthrough just has a lot of interesting ways to play. Browbeat, any player may have Browbeat deal 5 damage to them, and if nobody does, you draw 3 cards. A 3-mana draw 3, especially in red, isn't bad, and in a draft game, 20 life, they can choose to pay a quarter of their life. A quarter of their life is a fair bit. So that's just going to be a difficult choice for them. Burnout, you counter target blue instant, and then you draw a card at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep. I just think the art's really sweet, but also giving red an option to counter blue instants is going to be solid, especially if you have some sort of red, like maybe a burn theme going on. Even if it's not a theme, if you give red some solid options that they don't want countered, Burnout's just going to be a good option to counter spells. Burnt Offering, you sacrifice a creature and add its casting cost in any combination of red and or black mana. So you sacrifice your 3-drop, now you have 3 black and or red mana. It's definitely generally worse than Dark Ritual, but it's going to let you turn creatures that you don't need anymore into more mana. And if you have things like, Tolarian Terror, where they're going to maybe only cost 1, and then you can sacrifice them for 5, 6 mana, or whatever Tolarian Terror costs. It's just going to be a lot better than it seems. Cankerbloom, I think these creatures that can get rid of artifacts and enchantments are important, and I think Cankerbloom is probably the most important one. It's a 2-mana 3/2, which is just solid stats, and being able to sacrifice it to either destroy an artifact, destroy an enchantment, or proliferate is just solid. Plus, every set seems to have one of these of some sort these days, so yeah. Cannibalize, you choose 2 target creatures controlled by any one player, remove one of the creatures from the game and put a +1/+1 counter on the other, which actually comes out to exile 1. So exiling is very strong. It's going to get around indestructible, and I think generally when building a cube and or draft environment, you need removal, but if removal is too strong, I think the game ceases to be fun. Because if players can draft, like 6 or 7 removal spells and they're just removing all of your creatures, there's really not much enjoyment in the game. Which I think that's why Cannibalize works for me, because it's exiling, which is stronger than just destroying, but you're giving that player an upside too, and if you only have 1 creature, you can't target anything, so they have to have at least 2 creatures for it to even work. I just think more gimmicky, more interesting removal is going to play better than, Go for the Throat or Doomblade, or I actually really like Doomblade, but still. Set Evolver, it's a 2-mana 1/1, but it has Kicker for 1 in a red and or a green. If you pay the 1 in a red, it comes into play with 2 +1/+1 counters and First Strike. At that point, it's a 4-mana 3/3 First Strike, which isn't great. Or if you play it for the green, it gets +1/+1 and Trample. That's a 3-mana 2/2 Trample, which isn't great either. But a deck can choose to play this as just a 1/1 if they need it. If they're playing red and green, they can pay both costs and have a 5-mana 4/4 First Strike Trampler. It's not great, but I like giving players options. I think that's just going to be a more interesting play pattern than just a bear, I think it's going to be more interesting to have a Set Evolver than whatever blue bear. Chainer, Dementia Master, 5-mana 3/3, all nightmares get +1/+1. You can pay black, pay 3 life, and put a creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. That creature is black and is a nightmare in addition to its other creature types, and when Chainer leaves, exile all nightmares. I think in draft specifically, and less so, kind of less so in, standard and whatever, I think boss monsters are interesting. In Yu-Gi-Oh! They have quote-unquote boss monsters, where your whole deck plays out to get out this one creature, and that's how you win, or whatever. Or, you combo up to it. So I think having a quote-unquote boss monster in Chainer, it comes out, it's not an immediate threat because it's just a 3/3, but then on your next turn going, oh, I play black, 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 and I get this creature back. However, if you can remove Chainer, which is very feasible, you get rid of all the other threats. So it's kind of a, if I play this, I win if you can't deal with it, which I really enjoy over, like mid-range, whatever. Oh, I play Shieldred, it's a 4-mana 4/5, and it's just gonna slowly kill you. I want like a more immediate threat, I guess. Chainsaw, this is a newer card. It also has a sick alternate art. But when it enters, it deals 3 damage to up to 1 creature, and whenever 1 or more creatures die, you put a rev counter on it. An equipped creature gets +X+X, or +X+O, where X is the number of rev counters on it. So it enters, it removes something, and then it gives +1/+O. But then if more creatures die, it's just going to keep getting bigger. I like that it really scales with the game, and it's going to give you, not incentive to remove your opponent's creatures, but if you're blocking correctly, if you're destroying things correctly, it's going to make your creature get bigger. And you're not just destroying things to destroy things, you're destroying things to eventually get to, I attack, and my creature has +8/+O, and I win, or something like that. Next up is Charforger. It's a 3-mana 2/3, and when it enters, you create a 1/1 red Phyrexian Goblin token. Whenever another creature or artifact you control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, you put an oil counter on it, and then you can remove 3 oil counters from Charforger to exile the top card of your library. You can play that card this turn. It's a 3-mana 2/3, which isn't terrible stats, and it creates a 1/1 when it enters, which is nice. I just think it works really well in any sort of aristocrat strategy, or just general value strategy, where if your creatures are dying, for every 3 creatures that die, you're going to basically get an extra draw. That's not perfect, it's not super OP or anything, but again, it counts tokens, so even if you're playing something with, like, treasures, since it's a creature or artifact being put into the graveyard, even though tokens get exiled as soon as they hit the graveyard, they still count as entering the graveyard. So you just, oh, I sacrifice 3 treasures, I have 3 mana floating, and I'm going to exile the top card of my library so I can play it. It's just going to let you play more cards, and I think the play pattern is definitely more interesting. Charge Across the Araba. It's a 5 mana with Sweep. Return any number of planes you control to their owner's hand, and creatures you control get +1/+1 till end of turn for each planes returned this way. I like this kind of last resort, all or nothing. I'm going to return 7 planes to my hand and give all my creatures +7/+7 and swing in. Plus it's an instant, so you can kind of take into account what you want to do. It's not like an Overrun, where I think Overrun's is Overrun a sorcery? Overrun is a sorcery. So your opponents know you're going to full swing when you play Overrun, right? But if you full swing and you have, 3 unblocked creatures, well, I guess they all die, I like that it's an instant, I like that it gives you options, and I like the whole all or nothing playstyle. Sure, it's probably never going to be as good as it could be in like a mono white deck, because what are the chances you get enough white cards in a draft? But I think it's going to be interesting either way. Chronos Savant. It's a 6 mana 5/5, and you can pay 1 and a white to return it from your graveyard to play tapped, and you skip your next turn. Skipping your next turn is gonna hurt. But if you go, even if you're playing that Minotaur from earlier, so you go, turn 1, I play my 1/1. Turn 2, I play Blood Rage Brawler, and I discard Chronos Savant. And then turn 3, I pay for Chronos Savant, so now I have a 1/1, a 4/3, and a 5/5. Sure, I have to skip my next turn. Skipping turn 4 kind of hurts, but you have a solid board. And I think Chronos Savant is just going to be interesting no matter where it's played. Because at worst, it's a 6 mana 5/5. That's sure, it's like not great. It'll still hit though. The fact it comes into play tapped is going to hurt it a little bit. You can't block with it, but if you have solid enough blockers, it's not going to matter. And sometimes skipping a turn late game isn't going to matter. The other thing is, very rarely, you might want to skip your turn. Maybe you're about to die to Shieldred. Maybe you're about to die to whatever else is in this cube. Sometimes skipping your turn isn't inherently bad. Granted, you're going to have to take a turn eventually, but, maybe you could do something in the meantime. Really hard to tell. Next up is Circling Vultures. It's a flying 3/2 for 1 mana, and during your upkeep, you remove the top creature card in your graveyard from the game, or you bury it, which is, it gets destroyed, but you can't, like, regenerate it. So I guess you just sacrifice it now. But if it's in your hand, you can discard it, and you can play that ability as an instant. So you can just discard it if you want to put a creature in your graveyard to do, for whatever reason. And if you don't discard it and you have a graveyard full of creatures, you could just, bam, it's a 1 mana 3/2, and it has flying, so you can just swing it, and it's putting your opponent on a 7-turn clock, which isn't really bad, especially if you can consistently get things in your graveyard. Colossal Sky Turtle, it's a 7 mana, 6/5, flying ward 2. But it has 2 channel abilities, where for 2 and a green you can discard it and return target creature card, or return target card, not a creature, from your graveyard to your hand, or for 1 and a blue you can discard it and return target creature to its owner's hand. It's just going to give you options, even if you can't play it out as a creature for 7 mana, it's still just going to either let you return something else or bounce something. It's just always going to do something in your hand. Plus, I mean, 7 mana, 6/5 with flying in a draft isn't terrible. It could win a game, for all you know. Contraband Livestock, 1 and a white, exile target creature, then roll a d20. On a 1 to 9, its controller creates a 4/4 ox. On 10 to 19, its controller creates a 2/2 boar. And on a 20, its controller creates a 0/1 goat. It's removal. But again, it's not basic removal where I just destroy your creature. They're going to get something back, and even if it's something bad, it's still just a nice blocker for them. And I just think that's going to be more interesting than, I play Swords to Plowshares, your thing's dead. Oh, you gain 5 life, but really, who cares? Damogoth Titan. It's a 4 mana 11/10. When it attacks or blocks, sacrifice a creature. If you have creatures to sacrifice, if you're doing that little Squirrel Nest combo, where you get a squirrel every turn, because you untap the land on other players' untap steps, whatever, you always have things to sacrifice. And just an 11/10 for 4 mana is kind of nuts if you're in the right colors. So I always think it's interesting. I've seen it in some of the cubes I've helped friends build, and they've said that it just plays fun, because people are like, holy shit, like, that's scary. For 4 mana, yeah, that's scary. Dawn of the Dead, 2 black, so 5 mana. At the beginning of your upkeep, you lose a life, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you may return target creature from your graveyard to play. It gains haste, and remove it from the game at the end of turn. It's another, graveyard card. It's going to help with recursive strategies, so I mean, if your plan is to just get a bunch of shit in the graveyard and bring it back, you're only going to get that thing back for 1 turn. But being able to be like, okay, I bring back my 5/5, I swing for 5, and just being able to continuously do that, even if you have to exile at end of turn, just being able to bring one thing back every turn, I just think is interesting. It's going to be more interesting than a late to dinner, or whatever it's called, where you just return a creature, or a raise dead, whatever. It's just more interesting than a normal reanimate spell. Destructive Revelry, red and a green, destroy target artifact or enchantment, and it deals 2 damage to that permanent's controller. I think it's more interesting to have cards that are just going to do that extra little, deal 2 damage, whatever. I think that's just a more interesting deck. So I think it's really interesting in draft, especially for red and green, red and black, that sort of thing. Dracoplasm, when it enters, you sacrifice any number of creatures, and it comes into play with power equal to the total power of the sacrificed creatures, and toughness equal to their total toughness. It has flying, and it's a 2 mana creature. You can also pay red to give it +1/+0 until end of turn. I like that all or nothing. I could play it for 2 mana, sacrifice my whole board, and then maybe I win. I mean, it has flying, so if I can sacrifice enough creatures and give it enough power, it could win the game. I just think it was kind of like an interesting card. Again, I've had some of my friends put it in their cubes, and they've come back and they've said, like, yeah, it's either you win, or they have a single removal spell and you lose. And, I mean, I just think that's more fun than oh, I play my third 2/2, and then I swing for 6, and then I play another 3/3, and then, like, I don't really care for that grindy gameplay. I want to play something big, and I want it to do something crazy, and that's just who I am. To counter Dracoplasm, of course, which isn't a dragon, um, is Dragon Hunter. It's a human warrior, protection from dragons, and it can block dragons as though it had reach. And it's just a 1 mana 2/1. So it's got okay stats. 1 mana 2/1's good. Um, but if you have dragons in your cube, this could just be a fun little answer to it. Like, okay, I'm in white. I probably don't have that many flyers in white, but I have a Dragon Hunter, and I'm just going to be able to shut down whatever dragon my opponent plays because it has protection from dragons. So even if it blocks a 5/5, it's not dying. Even if it blocks that 2020 whatever unkillable dragon, it's not dying. So it's just going to put the game to a little bit of a stalemate, and it's going to give white a more interesting way to play in a cube with dragons. Elephant Resurgence. 1 and a green, each player puts a green elephant creature token into play. Those creatures have this creature's power and toughness are equal to the number of creature cards in its controller's graveyard. If you're playing a graveyard deck, you can take way more advantage of this and have a 2 mana, 8/8 elephant. Something like that. And alternatively, if you have ways like an Ashnod's Crypt or whatever, not Ashnod's Crypt, Tormod's Crypt, to get rid of your opponent's graveyards, you can have a big creature and they have no creature. Things like that. Elsewhere Flask, when it enters, draw a card, so you're never really going down a card with Elsewhere Flask, and you can sacrifice it, choose a basic land type, and each land you control becomes that type until end of turn. I just think this card's interesting, especially when there are cards that are like, count how many mountains you have, count how many forests you have, whatever. But also it's just color fixing, and it's just going to replace itself. It also works in, if you have an artifact strategy going on in your cube, they could just play it as a 2 mana artifact, and it'll count towards their affinity or whatever. I just prefer that. Essence Vortex, they arted this one up. But it's 1 blue and a black. You bury target creature, which I think just destroy this time. Sometimes bury becomes sacrifice. Sometimes bury becomes destroy and it can't be regenerated. Really depends. Destroy target creature unless its controller pays life equal to its toughness. So if your opponent has their big boss creature out, they could choose, okay, do I want to pay 6, 7 life and keep my creature? Or do I just let it die because I can't pay that? I think it's going to be interesting for a kind of like, not like a burn strategy, but like a burn strategy, where your opponent's going to have to choose how much closer to death do I, consider myself being okay with. Feud Killer's Verdict. 4 white, so 6. You gain 10 life. Then if you have more life than an opponent, you put a 5/5 white giant onto the battlefield. I like this as kind of a comeback card where, let's say you are at 8 life and your opponent's at 15, and you probably lose pretty soon anyway. You can play it, you gain 10, so now you're back up to 18, and now you have more life, so you create a 5/5. So it's either a win more or a comeback card, because if you already had more life, you're just winning more. And I mean, at that point, a 6 mana 5/5 really isn't terrible, especially a 6 mana 5/5 that's still gaining you 10 life. I think life gain is important to have somewhere in a cube. I think all sets basically play with life gain, even just a little bit. So Feud Killer's Verdict is just an interesting way to, go about it. Flare Husk. Living weapon, so when it enters, you create a 0/0 black germ and equip it to it. An equipped creature has +1/+1, and it also has equip 2. So it's a 1 mana 1/1, and then basically when it dies, it's just an equipment, which means you can just equip it to something else. So it works for equipment strategies. It just works as a good 1-drop, is how I see it. I think it's going to be more interesting than just having a plain vanilla 1-drop or whatever. Floatstone Surge. 1 in a red, creatures you control get +1/-1. Seems kind of good, seems kind of bad. This is a really subjective, if your deck wants it kind of card. Because especially in something like an aristocrat strategy, having creatures die when they enter could be really good for you. And at the same time, it could be really bad. Being able to bump up your whole board by 1 power could win you the game, or it could not. So I think Flowstone Surge is just going to be it's probably one of the last cards you pick in draft, but it could be a big difference depending on like how your deck's working. Fountainport Bell, I really like these. Enters, you may search your library for a basic land and put it on top, and you can sacrifice it to draw. So it's either a 2-mana draw if you choose not to like put a land on top, or it's a 2-mana land in hand. Either way, it's going to set you up for whatever you need. And it'll let you run more cards instead of more lands. Frog Tongue, A, the art's goofy. B, it's a aura that draws you a card when it enters, which I think is good because a lot of times auras, oh no, the creature dies, now what, you know? But it's replacing itself at least when it comes out. And it gives the enchanted creature reach, which isn't too crazy, but I mean, at the same time, reach can be good, especially depending on what your cube is built around. If you have dragons, if you have angels, whatever flying creatures are going to be a problem, this is just going to give the green deck a way to deal with those flying creatures, which I think is really important, especially since green doesn't always have that kind of, you know, they have their, Vine Lash and, you know, destroy target flying creature, but nobody wants to play those. They kind of suck. So yeah, Frog Tongue, I just think it's interesting, and the art's goofy as hell. Gargadon, I really like just being able to say, okay, turn 2. I suspend Gargadon. You have 4 turns to kill me, or else I put down a 7/5, and I probably win the game after that. A 7/5 Trampler is pretty hard to deal with. Sure, there's removal. Sure, they can, like, double, triple block it and whatever. But still, a 7/5 Trampler for 2 mana is going to be pretty nuts. And if you have the mana, you can just play it for 7. So I think it's just going to be a more interesting play pattern. Especially, I like when you can play cards for different mana costs. I like when you can suspend, when you can plot, you know, whatever. Play things ahead of time, and then have it all come to fruition on a later turn. Grim Reminder. Search your library for a non-land card and reveal it. Each opponent who played a card this turn with the same name as that card loses 6 life. Then shuffle the revealed card back into your library, and you can pay black to return it from your graveyard to your hand. I've talked about this card before. I think it's really interesting. And in a cube where everybody has access to the same cards, there's a good chance that you and your opponent, if you're in any of the same colors, or even if you both just have some artifacts, are going to be playing some of the same cards. And 6 life is about 30% of a player's life, so it's going to be pretty dangerous. I mean, you can just kind of kill them out of nowhere if you're lucky. So I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting to play around, especially in a cube that's working like a set, not just one-ofs, because I've seen people build cubes that are just, here's 500 one-ofs, and then you draft that. I think it's more interesting when, you know, we have 8 of each common and 5 of each uncommon and whatever, and it's being drafted like an actual draft. I think that's just way more interesting. Guided Passage, green, blue, red. Reveal the cards in your library. An opponent chooses a creature, a land, and a non-creature, non-land, and you put the chosen cards into your hand, then shuffle. So, I think this card's definitely more interesting in a non-draft environment, because in a non-draft environment, you can make your opponent be forced to choose certain things, right? You can be like, okay, I only have 1 creature in this deck, so they're forced to give you that creature. Or I only have 1 non-creature, non-land, which is pretty unlikely, but if you did, they'd be forced to give you that, whatever. But either way, it's 3 mana, I get a land in my hand, I get a creature in my hand, and I get something else in my hand. A 3 mana draw 3 isn't bad, and just being able to be guaranteed a land and a creature is going to be really solid, because it's going to help you develop on further turns. Sure, 3 colors can kind of hurt things, especially in draft, where playing 3 colors is kind of shaky, but I think it's just interesting enough to see some play. Hidetsugu Second Right. I love this kind of gimmicky 3 and a red. If target player has exactly 10 life, it deals 10 damage to that player. If you can get your opponent to exactly 10 life, killing them for 4 mana is pretty good. I mean, in a non-draft environment, that's Lightning Bolt, Shock, Shock, or Lightning Bolt, Tarfire, Tarfire. But I mean, in draft, who really knows if you're going to be able to get them down to exactly 10 life? And once you do it, if you do this game 1, they're going to make sure that you never get them down to exactly 10 again. They just know. But then again, that's also a game for you because you can go, okay, I full swing. And they're going to make sure that they're not at 10 life, but they might let themselves go down to 9 because they don't want to be at 10. It's just going to make them second guess themselves, and I think that's just interesting. Hijack, 1 red, gain control of target artifact or creature until end of turn, untap it, gains haste. So a lot of sets at this point, and I think a lot of cube design should reflect set design, have this 3 mana, gain control of target creature. I think that's kind of important at this point, and no matter what set you're playing, you're probably going to see one of those. This, I think, is more interesting because you can take an important artifact that does something, like a Mystic Forge or whatever else your opponent needs, just to, shut them off for a turn, which really doesn't matter, right? But you could also take a vehicle, which vehicles can be okay. You could take an equipment if your opponent has some sort of really strong equipment, even if you just get it for 1 turn, that could turn the game around. You could also take a creature, which creatures are always probably going to be the best option, but I think being able to choose a artifact is just going to give you more options, and I think more options is going to make for more interesting play. That's how I'm generally building. I want everything to be interesting. Hunting Pack, 7 mana, 7 mana, create a 4/4 beast, Storm. You will never be able to use this as well as you think you're going to use that, because Storm looks good, right? Storm is like, oh, I'll cast a bunch of spells, and then I will storm off with Hunting Pack and create a bunch of 4/4s and win. You're not going to be the one casting the spells. This is going to be turn 6, turn 7, if you even get that far. And your opponent says, okay, I play this creature, I play this spell, I play this spell, and you're like, great, I play Hunting Pack, that's why I left all my mana up, I now have 12 power on the board. It's never going to be as good as a, classic Storm, like a Tendrils of Agony. It's not going to be that good. You're not going to be the one doing the storming, but if your opponent has cast a couple spells, it's just going to let you build your board, pretty quickly. You could win with it. That's all I have to say, honestly. I just think it's really interesting, that whole turnaround of the opponent thinks they're about to win, they've played these cards, they've played, creature, draw, blah, 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 and then you can just turn it around with a Hunting Pack. Maybe not great, maybe not even good, but I like it. I like the play pattern. Insatiable Frugivore. 4 mana, 2/4. When it enters, create a food, then you can exile 3 cards from your graveyard. If you do repeat this process, you can pay 3 and a black, sacrifice X food, creatures you control get +X/+O and gain menace until end of turn. This, I like. So it works for artifact decks, token decks, life decks, go wide decks, because it can bump up your whole board, graveyard decks, because it gives you something to do with all those cards you put in your graveyard. Because let's be real, most graveyard decks only really care about the creatures in the graveyard. So you could get rid of all those instants and sorceries and the lands and whatever else you don't need to just bump up your whole board. I love that kind of card that can fit into a bunch of different decks. It can fit into artifact decks, if I didn't say that already. But that's the point. It's not just a one-trick pony where, okay, if you're building the life gain deck in draft, this deck or this card works for that deck and nothing else. No, this can work in a bunch of different archetypes, a bunch of different themes, and I think that's just going to be way more interesting and way stronger and way better to draft. Jar of Eyeballs. I just thought this card was interesting, and thus could be interesting in a draft. Whenever a creature you control dies, put 2 eyeball counters on Jar of Eyeballs. I don't know, man. What if a Cyclops dies? I think that's a bit of a flavor fail, really. What if a Beholder dies? Only 2 eyeballs? I don't know. Um, but you can pay 3 and tap it. Remove all eyeball counters from it. Look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of counters removed, and put one of them into your hand. So if your opponent board wipes or whatever else, this is going to let you find whatever the best card in your deck is to probably recover. Especially in like a 40 card draft, it's just going to let you find something to help you recover. It's kind of like insurance. I like to call this an insurance card, because when something bad happens, it's going to make it feel less bad. But it's definitely nothing great. Jaws of Stone, 5 and a red, deals X damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures or players, where X is the number of mountains you control as you cast Jaws of Stone. This is what I was talking with Elsewhere Flask, right? Where you can make all your lands mountains, and then this will become way stronger. I mean, either way, it deals X damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures or players. So if you have 5 mountains, it's a 6 mana deal 5. If you have more than that, it's just going to deal more. I really like cards that are going to count the number of basic land types, because it's going to incentivize you to play a more, like, to focus in on your deck building. You know, you're not going to, well, I'll splash a little red, or sorry, I'll splash a little black, I'll splash a little blue, you know, like, you're going to do less splashing when you have to actually focus up on what colors are important. I mean, it could be a win con, it could be removal. I just like that it gives you several, like, different options on how you're going to use it. Joven's Ferrets. If it's declared as an attacker, it gets +2 +0/+2. So it becomes a 1/3. A 1 mana 1/3 if it's an attacker. And at the end of combat, tap any creatures that block Joven's Ferrets. Those creatures do not untap during their controller's next untap step. That's interesting to me, because it's going to make your opponent think, how do I block this 1/3? Which is stupid, because it's a 1/3. It's not even good, but then if they block it with a 3/3 to kill it, they can't attack with that 3/3 next turn. And then you'll be free to swing in next turn with something probably much bigger. I just think the play pattern's interesting, so Joven's Ferrets has to get a mention. Jungle Patrol. 4 mana, 3/2, 1 green. Tap it, put a wood token into play. Treat it as a 0/1 green creature that's a wall. So I imagine it has Defender. Yep. And you can sacrifice a wood token to add red. Is this really all that good? No. But it's flavorful. I think flavorful cards need to have a place in sets. I think flavorful cards are interesting. Plus, I mean, you could stockpile wood, I guess, and then cast a really big red spell. I don't know. I just think flavorful cards are interesting. And what better place to put flavorful cards than a cube? I think a cube should be one of the best ways to show off cool card interactions and cool cards and cards with flavor. Because I think a lot of times in decks, no deck is playing Jungle Patrol, right? No deck is playing Joven's Ferrets. But in a cube, where everything is going to be on a similar power level if you build it correctly, these cards are going to be interesting. These cards might be playable, whatever. Last One Standing. 1 black and a red, so it's a 3 mana. Choose a creature at random, then destroy the rest. I love randomness sometimes. And being able to be, okay, it's a 3 mana board wipe. Maybe I get to keep a thing. Maybe you get to keep a thing. Who knows? It's just going to be way more interesting than, yeah, I play my board wipe and everybody's dead, and then the next 3 or 4 turns are just going to be us rebuilding, and I think that's boring. I think Last One Standing is going to, at random, put one player ahead of the other, and that's just going to be it. That's going to be, you know, where the game is. And then they're going to start attacking, and you're going to just figure it out, or whatever. So I just think it's more interesting than a normal board wipe. Lavissa Cold Eyes. 3 red for a 3/3. Barbarians, Warriors, and Berserkers have +2/+2 and haste. I like that it counts 3 different creature types. I think you can build typal synergies or tribal synergies or whatever you want to call it into your cube, and that's going to be interesting. I think, you know, a lot of sets focus on creature types now, so doing that in a cube makes sense. However, I like that Lavissa is going to hit 3 different creature types, so you don't have to focus on, oh, how am I going to put so many barbarians in this cube? because there's only so many barbarians. You could put barbarians, warriors, and berserkers, and they'll be solid, probably pretty consistent creatures otherwise, but when you have Lavissa, they just all work together. And I think that's just really cool. There are other cards that count multiple creature types, and I think any of those could really work in a set, in a cube. Magnetic Flux. Artifact creatures you control gain flying until end of turn. I think if you have an artifact creature faction, or, artifact creatures have a big place in your cube, I think Magnetic Flux is a cool win con for them. You build up your board, you give them all flying, and then you win. I think that's just going to be better, and it's going to be more true to, you could put Sleep instead, right? Sleep just taps all your opponent's creatures, so you're guaranteed to swing in or whatever. But any cube, any deck could play Sleep. I think giving certain factions, their cohesive win cons is going to be more interesting. I don't even know if to call them factions, strategies, whatever. But, your artifact creature, if whatever deck's playing artifact creatures, this is its win con. It's just giving them that one more option that they can pick and draft that other decks probably are going to have less use for. Mana Plasm. 2 and a green for a 1/1. Whenever you cast a spell, it gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is that spell's converted mana cost. As long as you're playing as many spells as you can every turn, on turn 4, it'll be a 5/5. On turn 5, it'll be a 6/6. It's just going to keep improving as long as you have spells to play. I just think that's going to be more interesting than a 3-mana 3/3. I like cards that actively do things and get bigger as the game goes on. I like dynamic gameplay. I play my 3/3 attacks, blah, 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 blah. I like cards that are going to grow with the game. Mind Shrieker. 1 and a blue for a 1/1 flying creature. Target player puts the top card of his or her library into the graveyard, and Mind Shrieker gets +X/+X, where X is the card's converted mana cost. You can use this as a mill card against your opponent, or if you build your deck to have higher mana values, you can use this against yourself. You play this turn 2, then turn 3, you activate it, and it might become like a 3/3. Then you swing. Then you activate it twice the next turn, and it's like a 5/5, and you swing. Sure, you can hit lands, and then it's nothing, but if you hit big enough cards, it could just win the game. I think flying is also really important, as it's going to let you act. It's going to act as a consistent win con, because it can get over with flying. Navigator's Ruin. 2 and a blue. At the beginning of your end step, if you attack with a creature this turn, target opponent puts the top 4 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. As long as you have a way to attack, even if it's just a 1/1 flyer, in a draft game where 40 cards is the goal in your deck, that's going to be 10% of the opponent's deck every turn. You're just going to keep milling them out, and it's just an interesting win mill card. Because I feel like a lot of the 3-mana mill is whenever you draw a card, target opponent mills 2. There's multiple cards that do that, right? And I think that's pretty boring. Sure, you'll win slowly, and if you have draw spells, it'll get better, but I think that's just a more boring play pattern than, okay, I have to attack to make them mill 10% of their deck. And even if you don't want to call it 10% of the deck, let's just be real here. You're playing this turn 3. Your opponent drew 7 cards when they started the game, and if they've taken 3 turns too, they have drawn 10 cards. So this is 4 over 30, given they have 30 cards left in their deck. That's about a 7th of their deck every single time. So you only need 7 turns of this to win. Even less because they're then going to be drawing cards during the 7 turns. And if you have other mill cards, it's just going to win the game faster than you would expect. Nether Spirit. White, black, black, 2/2. At the beginning of your upkeep, if Nether Spirit is the only creature card in your graveyard, you may return it to the battlefield. So I mean, here's the thing. Having it be the only creature in your graveyard isn't always going to happen. When it does, though, a consistently recurable 2/2, I think it's just going to be more interesting, again, than just a boring, 3-mana 3/3. Noose Constrictor. 2-mana 2/2, discard a card, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So it can finish off games by I discard my hand, it gets +7/+7, and I win. But it's also just going to help you fill your graveyard, so it helps with graveyard strategies. It can be a win con if you, attack with it. It has reach, so it can block flyers. Um, it's just gonna kind of do whatever you need it to do. Newscraft Mob. So it's 6 mana, 5/5 because it enters with 5+1/+1 counters. And whenever a player casts a spell, remove a +1/+1 counter from it. If you do, put a 2/2 black zombie token onto the battlefield. So even if it gets removed, when the opponent casts a spell, you'll remove a counter, and it'll create that 2/2. So I mean, technically, this is a 6 mana, create 5 2/2s, which isn't great, but it also isn't terrible. I think it's more interesting than just a normal, 6 mana 6/6 or whatever. Norrit. Norrit's just this guy, but he's 3 and a black for a 1/1. You can tap it to untap target blue creature, or you can tap it to force target creature to attack. If that creature can attack, destroy it at end of turn. So even the simplified version sucks. You choose target non-wall creature the active player has controlled continuously since the beginning of the turn. That creature attacks this turn if able. Destroy it at the beginning of the next end step if it didn't attack this turn. Activate only before attackers are declared. Basically, you can just force a creature to attack, and for whatever reason that it doesn't attack, it dies. Which I just think is interesting and kind of a cool card. So yeah, try it out in the queue. Offspring's Revenge. At the beginning of combat on your turn, exile target red, white, or black creature from your graveyard. Create a token that's a copy of that card, except it's a 1/1 and has haste. This is a good way to get back cards that have, like, solid ETBs, or just solid, like, static effects. And there's some creatures that are going to be good even if they are 1/1s, so just give it a shot, I guess. Orcish Lumberjack. It's one of my favorite 1-drops. So it's a red 1/1, and you can tap it, sacrifice to forest, and add 3 mana in a combination of red and or green. It's a way to accelerate mana super quickly, and I think it's going to be more interesting than a normal mana dork, because a normal mana dork, I tap it, I add mana, I'm basically 1 turn ahead of schedule, right? Orcish Lumberjack says, okay, hold my beer, I'm going to be 3 turns ahead of schedule, but you're going to have to sacrifice a land, so you're going to be behind next turn. It's a lot to ask for sacrificing a land, but I think it's just going to be way more interesting than a normal mana dork. Ornithark. I think this is a solid win con, so it's a 5 mana 3/3 flyer with Tribute 2. So it's either a 5/5 flyer, or, because of Tribute, or you get to create 2 1/1s. So it's going to put 5 power onto the board anyway, and sometimes having those birds is going to be better than having a 5/5. Sometimes having a 5/5 is going to be harder to remove, and it's just going to be better to attack with. But I just like it either way. I like that it's kind of giving your opponent the illusion of choice, because it's going to be strong either way. Peek, look at target player's hand, draw a card. The funniest thing you can do with Peek is target yourself. So you look at your own hand and draw a card. But also, I just like being able to have knowledge of what's in my opponent's hand. So I think it's just a cool option in a draft environment, giving you one more option, like, okay, I'm going to draw a card, but I also get to look at your hand, so I know exactly what you're doing next turn, and I'm going to have a better idea of how to win the game. Pathesis. This is another one of those suspend cards, right? This is suspend and it's removal, which I know I said I'm 50-50 on removal, but this one I find interesting because it destroys target creature and its controller loses life equal to its power plus its toughness. So you suspend this on turn 2. It'll cast itself turn 7, but your opponent's going to have to think about that, because if they want to play their big threat, they either have to wait till after turn 7, or they have to be sure they're going to be able to win, right? Because if they play a 5/5 on turn 5, they have, 2 turns? They have 2 turns. And if they don't kill you in those 2 turns, you'll destroy it and deal 10 damage to them. So it's really going to put the opponent on a clock, and it's going to make them watch what they have to do. I like these kind of cards. I'll always say it. I like a lot of different kind of cards, right? I like different game plans, I like different strategies, but I like the idea that they have to watch what they're playing and actively think instead of just, I'm going to play on my curve. Playing on a curve is good, it's pretty optimal, but I like making your opponent have to think about what they're actually doing. Plow Under. Really annoying. So 3 green, 5 mana. Put 2 target lands on top of their owner's library. Seems mediocre, right? They're just going to get their lands back. No. They're going to waste 2 turns because for their next 2 turns they're going to draw into lands, and you've gotten rid of 2 turns. So if you play this turn 5, this sets the opponent back to turn 3, and then they have to replay turn 4 and turn 5. So you're on turn 7, they're on turn 5, basically. Because they have to replay those lands, and they're not drawing any new cards to be useful, they're just drawing lands. I think this card's really strong in Draft. Could be stronger in other formats, but I think it's really strong in Draft. So I think it's good for a cube. It's going to give green options that aren't just, I play big creature, I attack with big creature. Preacher. So, I'm not going to make you read all that. You can choose not to untap Preacher during your untap step, and as long as it remains tapped, you gain control of target creature of an opponent's choice they control. You have to tap it to activate that. But, like, think about that. If they only have one creature, because you remove their other creatures, or they only have one creature out right now, you can steal their one creature and just hold on to it for the rest of the game with Preacher. I think Preacher's just interesting. I think the art's kind of goofy, but it's kind of strong in a way. Even if they're just giving away one creature, having that creature for, until you block with it, really. You block with it, it dies, and then you just untap Preacher, do it again. It's going to turn your opponent's board against them, and making them choose what creature they give you may be harder than it seems, because if they have a big beating creature and a utility creature, they have to choose. If they have 2 big creatures, they have to choose. It's just going to be difficult, and I think it's going to be interesting to make your opponent make that choice. Pteramander. Blue, 1 mana, 1/1, flying, adapt 4 for 8 mana, and it costs 1 less for each instant sorcery in your graveyard. So you play it on turn 1 as a 1/1, you can attack whatever it has flying, and then later on in the game it becomes a 5/5. I like this kind of malleable, it adapts with the game, because when you need a big creature, it can become that big creature. And when you just need to play your small 1/1 for turn 1, it is that small 1/1 for turn 1. It's just going to get better as the game goes on. It's not stagnant. I really don't care for stagnancy, because a Forest Bear, when you draw it on turn 2, is good, because it's a 2/2 for 2. When you draw that Forest Bear on turn 5, that's less good. But Pteramander, you draw on turn 1, it's good, you draw on turn 2, it's good, you draw on turn 7, okay, I play it, and then I immediately adapt it. It's just even better no matter when you draw it. Pulse of the Tangle. Put a 3/3 green beast creature token into play, then if an opponent controls more creatures than you, return Pulse of the Tangle to its owner's hand. As long as you only play this when your opponent has more creatures even after the beast, it's going to be pretty solid, because you can just keep recasting it. It's going to let you, go up against your opponent's token board. It's going to let your opponent just have to consider, okay, do I play another creature? Because if I play another creature, they can get another beast. And it's just going to let you keep refilling your blockers. So even if your opponent attacks, I cast Pulse of the Tangle, I cast Pulse of the Tangle, you can just keep doing that. And then if you have anything that's like, when you cast an instant sorcery, draw a card, it's going to help you refill your hand too. Quiet Speculation. Search target player's library for up to 3 cards with flashback, and put them into that player's graveyard, then that player shuffles his or her library. So if you have any sort of flashback theme going on, this could be a good option, because it just lets you put 3 spells in your graveyard that you're going to be able to cast. And sometimes flashback, sure, costs a lot more than just as is, but if you have, deep analysis and think twice and all of those kind of cheaper, even just like Faithless Looting, there we go, I could think of it. Being able to search target player's library for 3 Faithless Lootings, putting them in the graveyard, either they'll have to recast Faithless Looting with the flashback, which will suck for them, or you do it to yourself, and you have 3 Faithless Lootings in your graveyard, and you can do that. I just think it's kind of solid in any sort of flashback. If flashback is a theme in your, like, in your cube, it's a good addition. That's what I'm saying. Ragman. I like Ragman. I think he's kind of funky. I think he's a little strange. Reminds me of the Leatherman. If you know what that is, it's like this folk story. But Ragman is a 4-mana 2/1 black, black, black. Tap it. Target opponent reveals his or her hand and discards a creature card at random from it. Play this ability only during your turn. Not great, but again, if you're in a cube where everything's at similar power level, it could be good. Plus, being able to guarantee you get rid of a creature is going to be stronger than it seems, because being able to discard anything seems good, right? But being able to discard a creature means your opponent's going to have less chances to block, and it's just going to make their deck less consistent. And I mean, theoretically, if you're doing this every turn, you might be able to win from them just not being able to play creatures. No, Ragman. Where'd you go? There we go. Next up is Reckless Crew. 3 in a red, create X 2/1 Dwarf Berserker creature tokens, where X is the number of vehicles you control, plus the number of equipment you control. For each of those tokens, you can attach an equipment you control to it. So if your cube has equipments and vehicles, this is a pretty, like, solid addition for red. It's going to make a kind of consistent deck just by itself. You know, you throw in all the equipment you drafted, you throw in all the vehicles you drafted, and you throw in Reckless Crew, and then a couple creatures, and, you know, a couple lightning bolts, abrades, whatever removal you drafted. You know, and that's just going to be kind of consistent. It can help flood the board, it can just kind of create a board state by itself, so I think it's an interesting draft card in that respect. Relic Seeker. A 2-mana 2/2, Renown 1. When it deals combat damage to a player, if it isn't renowned, put a +1/+1 counter on it. It becomes renowned. And when it becomes renowned, you may search your library for an equipment, reveal it, and put it into your hand, then shuffle. It's basically a tutor for an equipment if it hits, which is pretty good for 35 cents. But budget aside, any cube that's going to have some sort of strong equipment, or just an equipment theme in general, Relic Seeker is going to be kind of good for, because it's just going to let you search that out. Sure, it's not going to fit into every cube, but I think it would be better to have a Relic Seeker in your cube than like a Steel Shaper's Gift. Not because Steel Shaper's Gift isn't more powerful, it is, but sometimes you need to sacrifice power for more interesting gameplay. You know, making your opponent have to make sure, okay, I need a creature to block Relic Seeker because I can't let them having that equipment. It's just going to be another level on top of gameplay. Rise of the Varmints. Create X 2/1 Varmints, where X is the number of creature cards in your graveyard. And you can plot this card for 3, so you don't have to pay 4. You could pay 3 on turn 3 and then cast it on turn 4 for free. Whatever. This is just a really good card for graveyard strategies, whatever's getting a bunch of creatures in your graveyard. I like it. I like that it kind of does its own thing by itself. Sure, you need ways to get creatures in the graveyard, but it's not like asking for a shit ton of investment. It's not asking for a combo. It's just like, have some creatures in the graveyard, create some tokens. I think you need some sort of cards that just kind of work by themselves in a cube. Rock Hatchling. When it comes into play, put 4 shell counters on it. During your upkeep, remove a shell counter, and as long as it has no shell counters, it has +3/+2 and gains flying. You kind of have to wait on it. And sometimes it's not entirely worth waiting. I mean, so it's a 1-mana 0/1, and then on turn 5, it's a 3/3. That waiting kind of sucks, but if you have another way to remove counters, it could be a little bit better. And in general, it's kind of like mid-rangey. I mean, your opponent can deal with it in the meantime, but if they don't, then you have a 3/3 for 1 mana, which is kind of solid. I kind of just think it's interesting. And again, I think at some point, Cube is where these flavorful cards are going to have their best showing, because I don't see a single commander deck where Rock Hatchling's really good. I don't really see a what's that? Legacy? I don't see a Legacy deck where Rock Hatchling is killing it, but Commander? Not Commander. In Cube, I could see it. I have Commander on the brain a lot. Next up, Rolling Hamsphere. 7 mana, 4/4, crew 3. Get the +1/+1 for each hamster you control, and when it attacks, create 3 hamsters, and it deals X damage to any target where X is the number of hamsters you control. This could just be a fun one-off vehicle, right? But if you think about it, you crew it once, then it attacks, creates 3 creatures that'll crew it the next time, and then it attacks as a 7/7 because you created those hamsters. So, I mean, it just kind of gets better as the game goes on, and a 7 mana vehicle kind of hurts, but if you have ways to, like, recur artifacts from your graveyard or whatever, it could be solid, or it could just act as a win con. Sage of Hours, this guy goes infinite, like, a bajillion ways, but honestly, I think having a way to take extra turns that isn't just, I pay 5 mana, I take an extra turn, is going to be more fun and interesting, plus it's going to give a home for those, like, giant growth and whatever else, where usually they're okay and there's time for it, but you don't always want to just, give a creature +1/+1 until end of turn. Whatever. You could target Sage of Hours, it gets bigger, and then you're also putting those counters on it, so eventually you can take extra turns. There's also a bunch of combos where this can go infinite, if I remember correctly, so do of it what you will. Scale Up, one of the most interesting cards I think I've ever seen, because it's kind of good and kind of bad. Until end of turn, target creature you control becomes a green worm with base power and toughness 6/4, and then you can overload it, pay 6 mana, and all of your creatures become 6/4s. So it's either a win con, or you turn your turn 1/1/1 into a 6/4 until end of turn, and it really swings. It's a sorcery, so you can't do this as like a reaction to like, oh, I blocked your thing, and then my thing becomes a 6/4. So it's kind of bad, but I just think it's interesting either way. Scour the Desert, 3 white, exile target creature card from your graveyard, create X/1/1 white birds with flying where X is that creature's toughness. If you have some strong creatures with big toughnesses and or ways to get things in the graveyard, this could be good. I actually just really like this card. It's kind of like an alternate win con in white, because sure, you exile something with 5 toughness from your graveyard, right? And you create 5 birds, and then they just kind of all swing in, and it's a different way to win with a spell that creates tokens, and yeah, I just think it's interesting in Cube. I think it can be built around really well. Season of the Witch. 3 mana, black, 3 total is what I'm saying. At the beginning of each player's turn, all of his or her untapped creatures that could have attacked but did not are destroyed. And if you do not pay 2 life during your upkeep, Season of the Witch is destroyed. Effects that prevent or redirect damage may not be used to counter this loss of life. So you have to pay 2 life during your upkeep, which is kind of sucks, but it forces players to attack every turn. In a aggressive deck where you were planning to attack anyway, this could be really strong, and your opponents being forced to attack with their creatures can kind of just kill them sometimes. Especially if you play this on your main phase too, so that your opponents have to be the ones to attack first. They attack, you block with your creatures, kill all their shit, and then you swing in for free. It can just be really solid. Sickening Dreams. This is another one of those, it gives you good ways to discard cards, but as an additional cost to cast it, you discard X cards. It deals X damage to each creature and each player, so it could also kind of act as a win con if you have a large hand. Either way, I play it on turn 2, I discard these 3 creatures to help fill up my graveyard, and then it, kind of board wipes, because 3 damage is probably going to kill most things on turn 2, and deals 3 damage to each player, and it just kind of does a bunch of small things that you wanted anyway. It's removal, it's letting you discard cards, it burns players, it kind of just does whatever you need. Skeletonize is a bad card, but it's so flavorful that I love it. 5 mana, deals 3 damage to target creature, and when a creature dealt damage this way dies this turn, you create a 1/1 black skeleton with black regenerate this creature. It's bad, but I really like the flavor. I mean, you kill something and you take its bones to make a skeleton, and I think that's cool. And the art is sick. That's so metal. Um, but yeah, play it because it's cool. Don't make your cube all optimal. I've talked before about, kind of build your cube like you build how a set would be built, blah, 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 blah. Well, sets are built with bad cards all the time. So build some cool cards into your cube because Skeletonize is cool. Slaughterhorn. It's a 3 mana 3/2, which isn't great, but you can also pay green and discard it to give target attacking creature +3/+2. So it's kind of like a giant growth that can only be used for attacking, which is meh, but just giving you two different options. I can play as a creature if I need a creature, or I can play it to bump up one of my creatures if I need my creature to survive, or if I need 3 extra damage to win the game, or whatever. Souls of the Faultless. 1 black defender. When it's dealt combat damage, you gain that much life, and attacking player loses that much life. And that's a 0/4. You block the biggest thing on the field. Even if it dies, which if it dies, your opponent's at least taking 4 damage and you're gaining 4 life. It's just kind of this strange threat, non-threat, where they have to watch out how they're attacking, but you also don't have to quite watch out how you're blocking with it, because even if you just block a 1/1, they take 1, you gain 1, and it was like, why did they attack at that point? I think it's just one of the more interesting walls. I mean, it's not a literal wall, but it's a creature with Defender, so I'm calling it a wall. Spoils of Evil. 2 and a black for each artifact or creature in target opponent's graveyard. Add 1 colorless mana to your mana pool and gain 1 life. I think the most interesting way to use this is definitely in like a mill deck, which you could then use to cast like an X mill spell. There's those spells that are like X and blue to mill X cards or whatever, right? This would be a good option for that, because, okay, they have 8 creatures in the graveyard already. You pay 3, you add 8 colorless, and you gain 8 life, and then you use that to mill 8 more cards or whatever. It's not great, it's nothing wild, and I mean, you have to choose artifact or creature, which kind of does hurt it a little bit, but I just think it's an interesting card, and Cube is the best place for it. Either way, it's kind of a ritual, so I mean, it could be really, really good if you built your deck correctly. Stoic Angel. 1 green, white, blue, so 4 mana. Flying, Vigilance, and players can't untap more than 1 creature during their untap steps. It has Vigilance. This is going to make your opponent's game hell, because if you have a solid blocker, Stoic Angel can just keep attacking in, and they'll have to untap their flyer eventually if they had it tapped, so that they can block Stoic Angel, but then they're not really like attacking. And it's gonna slow down the game, but there's cards like Propaganda, right, that just slow down the game for no reason. Stoic Angel slows down the game, but is also attacking for 3 every turn, so that you win the game. It's just a win over time card. Stormseeker. I just really like some of these like old-fashioned strange cards. It deals 1 damage to target player for each card in his or her hand. So if you have a way to make your opponent draw, could be good. But 4 mana for that, never ideal. But again, it's fun to build in these like older cards that would never ever see any sort of play anywhere else into a cube. I think cube is the best place to put them, really. So, Sudden Spoiling. Split Second. As long as this spell is on the stack, players can't cast spells or activate abilities that aren't mana abilities. I think Split Second is just kind of good as is, but also creatures target player controls become 0/2s and lose all abilities until end of turn. This is just going to let you swing in and possibly win for 3 mana. It's going to make all your opponent's creatures pretty useless. And the fact that it can't be countered, yeah, pretty good. The Ancient One. I like these, again, like the boss monsters, quote-unquote, where you kind of have to either build around them a little bit, or once they hit the field, there has to be something else to them. So, it's a 2 mana 8/8, but it can't attack or block unless there are 8 or more permanent cards in your graveyard. And you can play 2 blue and a black to draw a card and discard a card, and when you discard a card this way, target a player mills cards equal to its mana value. So, I mean, it can mill your opponent if that's what you need. It can draw you cards if that's what you need. And it's just going to be a big creature that kind of acts as your boss monster, quote unquote, if that's what you need. It just does a handful of different things, and I kind of like that, so yeah. It can kind of just act as the blue-black boss monster, you know. This is what blue-black wants to get to. They want to get 8 permanents on their graveyard, and they play Ancient One, and then they swing in for 8 multiple times. Whatever. The Stasis Coffin, it's this stall non-stall card where you can pay 3, and then you pay 2 and tap it to exile it, and you gain protection from everything until your next turn. Protection from everything is good. It's going to stop you from dying for 1 turn, and that's all you need sometimes. I think Stasis Coffin is going to be more interesting than Teferi's Protection. Teferi's Protection protects your shit, right? That's boring for the opponent, and it's going to be kind of boring for you as you just kind of sit out, right? The Stasis Coffin means your shit's still interactable. I think you can technically still lose life. Not from combat, but if a spell says each opponent loses X life or whatever, you'll still lose that life because you're not being targeted. But it's also protection, and it also can just count towards an artifact in artifact decks, and it kind of just sits on the board until you need it, which I really like. Thunderous Wrath. 6 mana, deals 5 damage to target creature or player, or if it's the first spell you draw this turn, you can pay 1 red to cast it. So for 1 red, you deal 25% of the opponent's life to them, which I really like. I played this card in, I put together this Otter deck when I built decks to play with, I guess, my now ex-girlfriend. And she did not, she didn't like Thunderous Wrath. She also didn't like Expressive Iteration for some reason, but she really didn't like Thunderous Wrath because she'd be like, okay, I'm starting the game at 20, and then I would draw for turn 2, or turn 3, or whatever else, and be like, oh, drew Thunderous Wrath, and she'd be like, shit. Because, you know, it's pretty scary. I mean, 5 damage out of nowhere for 1 mana is pretty nuts. I think that's just an interesting draft card. I think it saw modern play at one point, but I think it's more interesting in draft. Especially, I built this draft cube. Like, I built this cube for my friend. And the red burn deck, or not red burn deck, but like the overarching red burn cards weren't like Lightning Bolt and, you know, small creatures with haste. It was like Thunderous Wrath and these other cards that could deal a whole bunch of damage for cheap, but you had to be like in a certain situation. Like Thunderous Wrath has to be the first card you draw, or that one card where it counts the number of mountains, where if you play the deck correctly, you can deal a shit ton of damage. But you had to be doing certain things for different cards, and it came more interesting when I drafted it with him because you actually had to focus on what you were playing instead of just red 1 drop, red 2 drop, red 3 drop. You would be like, okay, 5 damage here, 10 damage here, whatever. So yeah, I love Thunderous Wrath. Tidal Wave, 2 and a blue, put a 5 blue, or put a 5/5 blue wall creature token with Defender onto the battlefield and sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. I like giving blue different things to do on the opponent's turn. Everybody knows they have Counterspell, right? But if blue holds up 3 mana, what are you expecting? You have no clue what they're about to play. So I think Tidal Wave is interesting because if they have, you know, blue, red up or whatever, you can either expect a Counterspell, a bounce spell, or if you know Tidal Wave is in the cube, they could just Tidal Wave whatever you attack with. And I mean, a 5/5 blocker is gonna probably destroy whatever you're attacking with. So it just gives blue more counter defense options, I guess. It's not really a counter attack because they're not attacking, but it's gonna destroy your attackers without blue investing too much into it. Unlucky Witness. It's a red 1/1. When it dies, exile the top 2 cards of your library, and until your next end step, you can play one of those cards. I like cards that give you advantage when they die, and I think Unlucky Witness as the red 1/1, you know, because a lot of sets have their 1 drop in red, and it's just a kind of solid creature. I think Unlucky Witness is going to be more interesting than a hasty creature. That's just how it is. I like cards that are going to get better, because if you draw your DRC, or, well, actually, DRC is a bad example. If you draw your Monastery Swift Spear on turn 5, right, it's still going to be okay, but it's like meh. If you draw Unlucky Witness on turn 5, you play it, you find a way to sacrifice it or have it die, so it's just card advantage, basically. I mean, it's replacing itself, which is pretty important. Ursine Filja. I kind of just put the card on because I really like the art, and again, I think that's the best way to play things. But 5 mana 3/3 comes into play with 4 healing counters on it. Remove a healing counter, prevent the next 1 damage that would be dealt to it this turn. You can pay 2 and a white to put a healing counter on it. So it's just kind of harder to remove because of the healing counters. It doesn't really do too much, but I think it's interesting either way. Wood Sage, one of the last 2 cards. Green and blue, 1/1. Name a creature card. Reveal the top 4 cards of your library. Put all of them with that name into your hand. Put the rest in the graveyard. This works for self-mill, creature decks that are looking for specific creatures, but you could also misdirect your opponent. If you say, you name, I don't know, what's a creature that just beats a certain deck? Like, Laboratory Main, I don't know. You could just name a specific creature, and even if you don't have it, it's going to make your opponent worry. And you'll still get to mill yourself 4 cards, which is pretty solid. Or you name whatever creature you need. If you need Laboratory Maniac, you say, okay, Laboratory Maniac, and you just keep milling. Especially in a 40-card format, that's 10% of your deck every turn, until eventually you find that creature card you need. So I think Wood Sage is just pretty solid. Last up, Zerta Druid. Red-green, 1/1. Tap it, add green. When you tap it for mana, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. Simple, but again, I think it's more interesting to have these mana dorks that do something than mana dorks that just add mana. Because, I mean, there's like the 2 mana dorks that are like 1/3s or whatever, and they add 1 mana of any color or whatever. I think that's something, but I think it would be a more interesting cube if you have, okay, red-green is this kind of consistent set of colors where, you know, you have a mana dork that taps to deal damage as well as adding mana. You have, what was that card earlier, where it's just red and green, destroys an artifact or enchantment, and it deals 2 damage. You could have red and green be this just kind of dealing damage over time kind of color set in your cube. And I think that would just play more interestingly than mana dork and basic removal spell. That's it. So it's been a little over 100 cards that I think you should consider for your cube. Some of them not very powerful, but I don't think power is everything when it comes to building a cube. I think you want cards that people want to play. I think you want cards that are interesting or unused. I think sometimes even just art is important, right? Because if I see, like, Season of the Witch, even if it's not good, I want to play it because it just looks cool. It's this cool older card with a sick art, and I think that's kind of important, right? I think cube is what you make it, really. So make your cube as close to a set, as far to a set as you want. Make it as interesting or as boring, as strong or as weak. Make your cube how you want it. And that being said, these are just some cards that, if you even consider playing one of these, that's something. If you consider playing 10 of these, I did my job. But this has been MTG Man, signing off, yo. I will, yeah, bye.